with missions convention starting this week, I decided to spend a few minutes tonight just doing a short overview of missions in the Old Testament. My theme tonight is very simple. God is doing a great work in our world, and He has invited you and me to join in that work. I don't find the missionary message of the Bible to be one of guilt. Not a message where God says, why are you enjoying beautiful music, comfortable sanctuary, Christian fellowship in Hobe Sound, while the world has not heard the gospel? You should feel horrible. Instead, the missionary message of the Bible is a message of joy and opportunity. God says, you have the incredible privilege of being part of what I'm doing in the world. You get the opportunity to share the most wonderful news man has ever heard. And so I want to look at that a few minutes tonight. We could start in Genesis 3, where God promises that Jesus will someday defeat the power of Satan. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Despite man's rebellion, despite our sin, God has not given up on His great plan to bring salvation to all people. We move on to Genesis 12, where we begin to see our part in God's work. God gives Abraham, Israel, and now in the New Testament, the church, the privilege of being part of His mission to bring redemption to the nations. Genesis 12:1, God calls Abraham, and notice the purpose for his call. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And then he gives the reason, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God blessed Abraham for the sake of all the families of the earth. He was blessed not for his sake alone. He was never intended to hoard the blessings. Israel was never intended to hoard God's blessing to herself. Instead, Abraham, Israel, was chosen for the sake of the nations. In the New Testament, Abraham's mission is now our mission, the church's mission. You and I have been blessed with the gospel, and in turn, we are called to bless the nations. Again, this is not a matter of guilt. It is a privilege. It is the incredible opportunity to be part of God's great plan to bless all nations. All through the historical books, we see how Israel fulfilled her mission when she was faithful to God. In Genesis, Joseph testifies to Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. Naaman, a Syrian commander, hears about Elisha from a slave girl. She becomes a missionary, testifying to a foreign general about Israel's God. Daniel witnesses to the rulers of Babylon and Persia. Over and over, those who were faithful to God became a blessing to the nation. But sadly, much of Old Testament history is a record of Israel's failure to accomplish her mission. Instead of blessing the nations with the message of Jehovah, Israel often turned to the false gods of the very nations she was called to reach. When she was faithful to God, Israel blessed the nations. But when she was unfaithful, Israel failed in her mission to the nations. It's still true today. When the church is faithful to our task, we are a blessing to the nations. Several years ago, a researcher from Baylor University, a man by the name of Dr. Robert Woodbury, did a study of the secular impact of missions. He asked this question: do countries benefit socially from the influence of missionaries? He measured things that we don't measure in a church mission study. He measured literacy rates, political freedom, economic prosperity, social equality. And he found that in every area, countries that had a strong Protestant missionary presence in the 19th century were far more advanced 100 years later than countries without that missionary influence. When Professor Woodbury published his research, academics were outraged because secular universities have long accused missionaries of being bigots who destroy native cultures. How could anyone claim that missionaries were a positive influence in our world? But in about 20 years or so since he did this research, dozens of researchers have done it again, trying to prove him wrong, and every one of them has failed. When the church is faithful to our mission, we become a blessing to the nations. But, as with Israel, the opposite is true. You read the 19th century history of missions, a golden age of evangelical missions. But you move into the early 20th century, and many missionaries from mainline churches replaced the gospel with a liberal social gospel that gave little of the message of salvation, and soon the church began to undermine the message it had once preached. Today, among many churches, it is overseas churches who are the ones holding on to the gospel against the liberalism of their Western leaders. A few years ago, the Anglican Church held a conference at Lambeth. Their British church leaders were speaking in support of gay marriage. They were mocking the doctrines of inspiration, salvation through the blood of Christ. And an African bishop stood up, and he said, "Sirs, 150 years ago, your great-great-grandparents from England brought the Bible to my country. Why do you no longer believe the book that you brought to us?" 2 weeks ago, I was in Zambia, and there was an evangelist from Rwanda who was attending our class. And he was looking at the courses, and he asked a lot of detailed questions about the doctrinal sections of our courses. And he finally explained, he said, I have to be very careful because so many theologians from America are exporting false doctrine to the church in Africa. You see, here's what has happened. A compromised Western church is failing in our mission to bless the nations. To fulfill God's call to Abraham, to Israel, to the church, we must be faithful to the message we have been given. But let me move on. The missionary message of the Old Testament does not end with Israel's failure to fulfill her calling. Despite her failure, God continued the call to missions in the Old Testament. Psalms is one of the great mission books of the Bible. The phrase "the nations" appears 58 times in this book, and many of these are calls to mission. The psalmist inviting the nations to worship Yahweh. Just a few examples. Psalm 67 points back to God's call to Abraham. The psalmist prays, and you can hear the words that were given to Abraham. "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face to shine upon us, that your way may be known on earth, your saving power among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you." The psalmist prays that God will bless Israel so that his saving power will be known among all nations. When Israel fulfills her mission, people from every nation will join in praise of God. We see this fulfilled when we come to Revelation 7. "After this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb.'" Again, these psalms are not about guilt. God's missionary purpose will be accomplished. The psalmist is not afraid that God will fail in his purpose, but he rejoices that he has an opportunity to be part of inviting the nations to praise God. And we are invited to be a part of that. Some more examples. Psalm 22, starting at verse 27, the psalmist looks forward to the day when God's mission to reach the world will be accomplished. He writes, "All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. All the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations." We have the privilege of announcing the good news that God is already king over all the nations. And we are invited to be ambassadors representing that great king to the nations. I love David's words in Psalm 86. He says, "There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, neither are there any works like yours." He says, "Lord, these other gods, I see them all around me, but they are nothing compared to you." And then he arrives at the logical conclusion. If the other gods are nothing, if those gods are going to be shown up to be frauds, then someday all nations will worship the true God. So he says, verse 9, "All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name." And again, think of it. We get to be a part of this process. We have the privilege of introducing people to the one true God, the King of the universe. That should not cause us to feel guilty. That should cause us to feel excited about missions. I used to be a piano teacher, and one of the nicest parts of teaching piano was introducing a student to some wonderful piece of music that they had never heard before, to watch as they started to realize the beautiful sounds they could make, to open their ears to a new world. How much greater is the joy of opening the eyes and ears of unbelievers to a God they have never known, to open their hearts to a world of joy and blessing, to invite, in the words of the psalmist, to invite all the nations you have made to come and worship before you, O Lord. Then we come to that great Psalm 96. It's the last one I have time for tonight, but the whole psalm shows the joys of missions. Let me just read a few excerpts. And as you listen, again, rejoice that you and I have a part in sharing this message with those who do not yet know this great God. Psalm 96 begins, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth." Verse 3, "Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. Great is the Lord, greatly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods, for all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols. But the Lord made the heavens." So how should we respond to this Lord who made the heavens? Verse 7, "Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Do you hear it? All nations, all the earth, all the peoples, those who have never yet heard of his great name are invited to worship. And you and I get to carry the invitation." Let me move on quickly to look at the prophets. Over and over, the prophets call Israel back to her mission. One of the great examples is Isaiah 45, a chapter that speaks to Cyrus, a man who's not yet born. It's going to be 150 years before he's born, but God says to this future king of Persia, "I have chosen you. I have a job for you to do." And who has chosen him? The only true God. 9 times in one chapter, God says, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Beside me, there is no God. Verse 6, he says that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. This is the true God of the whole world. His name must be proclaimed, acknowledged, worshiped in all the world. That is what missions is about, proclaiming this God to the nations who do not yet know who he is. One more example from Isaiah, Isaiah 56, verse 7. God promises to bring people from all nations to worship him. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. The house of God will be open to all the nations. All people, he says, will join Israel in praise of God. This is the verse Jesus quoted when he drove the money changers out of the temple. The religious leaders of that day had replaced the court of the Gentiles, a place where Gentiles, all nations, could come to pray to Israel's God. They had replaced it with a marketplace. And Jesus said, "You have turned the house of prayer for all nations into a den of thieves." But just a few months later, at Pentecost, the temple, it's now the Church of Jesus Christ, is once again opened to all nations. God's house has once again become a house of prayer for all peoples. The last book of the Old Testament gives this wonderful promise. For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name shall be great among the nations. In every place, incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering, for my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts. Again, his name will be great among the nations, and you and I get to help make the announcement. Let me close with the book of Jonah. Jonah ends with a question from God to this angry prophet. The last words of the book, God says, should not I pity and show mercy on Nineveh? God is saying to Jonah, Jonah, do you love the people I love? You love the Israelites, so do I. But do you love the Ninevites? Because I love them. And as I read that, I hear God saying, Randall, you love Americans, so do I. You love people who look like you, so do I. But do you love that great multitude of Muslims who despise Christ and the church? Because I love them. I hear God saying through Jonah, do you love the people of those nations who seek to destroy America? Because I love them. You see, the book of Jonah is a call to missions even to those who consider themselves our enemies. Missions to those who do not welcome missionaries. But again, we have the privilege of introducing them to a great God they do not know, but a great God who is King of all peoples. I'm getting ready to leave to go teach in Papua New Guinea, so I'm going to miss Missions Convention. So it's not very fair for me to say this, but I want to encourage you to be here every night. Not because, well, it's on the church calendar. The pastor will notice if we're not there, so we better go. But because the God who said to Abraham, I will bless you so that you can bless all nations, that God says to Hobe Sound Bible Church, I have blessed you so that you can bless all nations. And it should be absolutely thrilling to get to be a part of that call.